This is the fundamental dynamic of our industrial agricultural system. It's a system of domination and control, not just of the natural landscape. The ultimate control is the control of humanity. The act of farming and agriculture is not just producing food. The act of farming is the radical act of world building. We grow food in ways that take life, not nurture it. And the gateway to environmental erosion is social erosion, first and foremost. There is no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the unheard, the unlistened to. We work to build new narratives. And the reason we do that is because we believe that power always rests in people. I want to just invite people to listen to folks that they're not listening to exit their perspectives and their worldviews and to engage in a deeper conversation that reflects on power and consolidation and control. Because so often the solutions that I see to feeding the world further consolidate control in the hands of the few. And I think that is the most dangerous thing.
Welcome to the FutureKind podcast, where conscious nourishment is our guide. From the cellular to the cosmic, we're exploring how our relationship with food has the power to transform the world. Loren Cardeli, welcome to FutureKind.
Thank you, Megan. It's an honor to be here.
So I've been thinking about the very first conversation we've had after our dear friend Errol Schweitzer introduced us. And I was just telling someone about this last week, actually, because I don't know if I've ever told you this, but it really struck me at the time. I feel like from that very first time we talked for maybe like 2 hours, which is usually what happens when we start talking to each other. Mm-hmm. But I was expecting, like, because it was our, it was a work context and it was our first time meeting. And there's kind of like a formula in my world for how that goes of like, here's my background, here's the work I do with my organization, here's what my organization cares about. And then like the other person does that. And I had actually never really realized until that conversation with you how it's very unconscious, but just like that formula is so consistent. And you and I didn't say any of those things. We like talked about like, I don't even remember everything, but it was very personal and very human. And after we got off, I was like a little bit like, wait, did that count as work? Like, was that a work call? And then I realized my interpretation of it is that because you largely work in the majority world in a different context where the value, like the preeminent value of relationships hasn't been eroded the way that it has in like Western business world, that's like for millennia and for humans, that's like how you start, right? Is like connecting as people, being in relationship, knowing like who are you really, which isn't something you can tell by your well-worn stories of like, here's what my organization does. Yeah. So I don't know if I've ever told you that, but I really appreciate that about you. Like that's consistently been my experience and like the way you're a bridge to this whole other part of the food system, the majority of the food system in the work that you do. And I was thinking that it could be cool to start with just hearing some of like, how did you get into that whole other world of food? Because you grew up in the Northeast US, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, can you share a little bit about your journey? And right now you're sitting in your home in Mexico City.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The journey is such a hard one to kind of tap into because I think when we think of our journey, there's so many things that happen in that journey that change us to who we are. It's not this kind of linear path. It's this path that it's constantly moving around and changing, and where we dictate that like point of transformation changes the whole story. And, could that be something based on when you were a young child, right? Like, I grew up in a very heightened intellectual kind of family. My parents were, working in mental health. And so there was a lot of dialogue, and it's kind of standard New York dynamic. And dinner was the place where we came together. It was ours, and that was the only rule growing up, was be home for dinner. And if you weren't home for dinner, that was a problem. That was a major problem. And so we ate together as a family, and we discussed and dialogued on everything. I mean, we're the kind of family that when you watch a movie for 2 hours, you spend 3 hours talking about it, and I grew up with a language disorder. I had a word retrieval problem. I had a speech impediment. I had focus issues, ADHD. I mean, I had just a soup of challenge, and that kind of made it really hard to communicate. And I remember this very dominant in my head, right? This sitting around with people, and you want to be able to communicate, you want to be able to share, but the words that come out are drastically different than what you're thinking in your head. They're not making sense. And people laugh at your misuse of words or whatever. And you feel that, you feel in that moment, this stuck, this paralysis, this dynamic of pain. And I can tell you that it's those moments that I sit with that give me probably some of my most compounded anxieties or whatever in life today, however they would translate, right? Whatever that means. But when I think of my life and the times where I've almost died through drowning, through violence, through whatever, right? These drastic situations that have happened to me all over the world. It's that moment, being in a situation, a schoolroom, a dinner table, a conversation where people mock you for what you say, which feels the most dark, that feels the most pain, generative, right? And I think in that aspect, I quickly realized that there is no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the unheard, the unlistened to, and it was, and I think that has always helped me to position my focus away from the dominant kind of narrative and understanding of a system, and look deeper at what is at play, what is fundamentally different here, right? And I think that journey of reclaiming my language, learning to use it as a strength and not a weakness, has been one that has really transcended my life, right? In many ways. And as I learn new languages, I feel that anxiety again now in my older life, where I didn't earlier. And it sits there in a way of I don't want to be mocked again. So I get clam up in this paralysis sometimes, right? And that feels really uncomfortable, right? And so I think that's a way to tell my story. And that's a way to tell my story that I haven't always told my story about where I originated. And many times I've told this story of where the ideas originate was 10 or 12 or 15 years later, right? So I think I like to mix that up, I guess. I think that's exciting to think about the many ways of my journey that shaped who I am and where the organization and, is today.
Yeah. I mean, that does feel really resonant about part of your journey. And it's also always so hard for me to imagine you, because you truly are one of the most gifted with language people that I've ever known. Your writing and your speaking, and it is so interesting to just contemplate how I think that's often the case, that our greatest strengths and our greatest weaknesses are two sides of the coin. And yeah, seeing how that, how you have transcended that, and then how it's a through line for your whole story So that really makes sense. And then there's this whole piece about agriculture and food in particular. So where did that come from?
Yeah, I think, well, I started farming at when I was 16 years old. I started getting into agriculture through dairy farming and up in Vermont, and I quickly realized that that has its own form of language, right? In a time where I didn't feel confident in my ability to communicate and to express myself, I gravitated first to art and music as all the mediums of communication. And then when I was able to embrace like the environmental and ecological world, that became a new medium for communication. And I found myself being both embodied and embodying it, you know, in many ways. And that was something that really brought me comfort. And then when I was 18 years old and able to legally leave the country, I did that, and I flew to Belize and rooted myself deep in agroecological communities in several countries over several months, and traversed Central America, working on farms and learning from communities. And it was in the beginning where I was living on a, and this is a much longer story, of course. That can take hours to tell, but the summarized version of the story is I was living in a community with two folks in a small kind of slash and burn community where we were far away from electricity or power. I don't even know if cell phones were around there. I didn't have a cell phone at that time or Facebook account. And we grew our own food and hunted our own meat and drank from the same stream that we bathed and washed our clothes in. And it was a complete, you know, off the grid kind of living situation where I learned a lot about indigenous and ecological knowledge systems that were native to the jungle on the border of Guatemala and Belize. And our nearest neighbor was like a 2-hour walk. And that was this little community that was connected off this kind of logging road, which was just this really rough kind of path to get there. But they lived in these little palapas, these thatch huts, of course, just like us. And they, even though Belize's national language is English and everybody spoke English, they only spoke Spanish because they were so remote. And so one day I hadn't been that successful at hunting, and I walked there to get some meat. I went to buy some chickens to bring back to kill and cook. And I was negotiating the price of chickens when I heard this screaming, and I saw this man about my age today, probably younger, holding his young son in his arms, screaming. And his young son had drinking accidentally the pesticides the father used on his farm and had passed. And it was this community coming together, grieving and moaning and weeping around this child's death, which I witnessed, and I realized that we grow food in ways that take life, not nurture it. And it was such a visceral, direct reaction at that moment of seeing that sorrow, that pain, that injustice, right? And I felt that I was just this 2 hours walk deeper into the bush with these two folks. And it was like, how could I be so close, but yet so far away from that reality? We were living completely off the grid, not using any kind of chemicals or any kind of, inputs. But yet this community connected to the logging road was connected thus to the market. And what that market meant was that salesmen of the industry would peddle their products, and they would push their products, and they would create a model of not growing for ourselves and for community, but for growing for others. And what I saw was firsthand that that community, through the connection to the market, had lost all of this indigenous knowledge that I was soaking up like a sponge and learning from. And that the gateway to environmental erosion is social erosion, first and foremost. And how we lose that culture, our grounding to place, and that connection and that knowledge that was passed down through generations and generations. And that is the power of our market-based agricultural system. That is the invisibilized tentacles of industrial agriculture, that it turns us into a dependent versus a sovereign people. And this is why what we see so often is in our agricultural food system, 60 to 70% of the world's hungry are actually involved in it, are actually in the food system, because we are starving the very ones who grow food, because we are turning these incredible peasants, and innovators and unnamed scientists, aka farmers, into folks that are captured by cycles of debt, hunger, and poverty. And that's the danger that we're in, right? And so I think that lesson really kind of cemented an early stage political understanding of agriculture that kind of really helped me along the way become who I am today.
Well, that's really powerful. I'm thinking about like that social erosion and knowledge getting passed down. And I'm thinking about farmers in the United States where the industrial agriculture system, we're like generations deep into it now. And that like there is this interesting dimension to the challenge where like what is actually perceived as culture, well, what is the culture that is getting passed down is industrial agriculture. And so like that importance of like identity and social connection, which is just so deeply human, and that persists, in communities that are deep in industrial ag and chemical use and GMO use and all of it. I'm curious, like, how do you think about that in the context of, compared to communities that are have less distance between like their non-industrial, commercial capitalist influences?
How do I compare that?
Like I'm just curious because the majority, I think you're like 80% of the world's food comes from the global south or the majority world. And also like, I know that the listeners to this podcast are largely based in the US. And one of the things that you and I talk a lot about that I want to like lift up in this conversation is that I think it's easy, especially for folks in dominant culture in the US, to hear stories like that and think of it as like something that's happening somewhere else that isn't super relevant for them. And so I'm like kind of just thinking about the translation of what does it mean to restore like a different way of being with each other and with the land in the context of the US, where it's like generations deep into use of industrial agriculture. Why does it matter to them, like these stories of what's happening in elsewhere in the world? And this could be actually a good opportunity to say what a growing culture is and does as part of this also, because you're such a brilliant storyteller and inviting people into that. And it is such a need because we tend to be pretty siloed here and like pretty asleep to what's happening in the rest of the world and the bigger food movement. And that's such a powerful thing that you bring.
Yeah, well, I think those are so there's several questions there that I'll try my best to kind of weave together and answer them all. I think it's important to realize that when agriculture became agribusiness, we didn't lose necessarily the focus on the environment. We lost the connective tissue to culture, right? That's the word that got swapped out. And that our relationship with the land around us is fundamentally mirrored by our relationship to ourselves, right? And so as long as we have systems of injustice and exploitation within our own societies, we will have relationships with the natural world that are exploited, right, and extractive. And that those systems just kind of compound and reinforce each other. And so I think what's really important to understand is that the act of farming and agriculture is not just producing food. The act of farming is the radical act of world building. It is shaping the world around us and reimagining relationships with the natural land, with nature, with resources, with soil, with plants, with seeds, with the birds and the microorganisms, but also with our community and ourselves and our loved ones, and our spirits. And so I think that is such a radical act. And I think when people reduce our agricultural systems and understanding to the production of calories, they fail to realize so much of what our food system is about. And I think that is at the fundamental heart of the problem that we're in today, is because peasants and indigenous folks are not asking to be fed. They're asking for agency and power in shaping our food systems around them. And this is what the language that we tend to use fails to recognize or understand. That the most dominant frame of measuring the efficiency of a food system is what? It's food security. That is used by textbooks, by academics, by journalists, by UN and development institutions and governments. However, yet, I want to invite everyone listening to understand, where are you food secure? Where can you be food secure? Because in reality, you are food secure in a prison, but you have no choice of what you're eating, no power, no agency, but you're being fed. And is that the world that we want to live in? And this is the fundamental dynamic of our industrial agricultural system. It's a system of domination and control, not just of the natural landscape when it ships these beautiful, biological, diverse landscapes into monocultures. But that's one form of control, but the ultimate control is the control of humanity. And that's why Thomas Sankara said, those who feed you control you. That's why Leah Penniman in the United States says, to free ourselves, we must feed ourselves. Because this is the sacred act of reclaiming agency. And this is not something that we must learn anew. This is something that is deeply embedded in the epigenetic memory of each and one of us. It is something we must remember. That sacred relationship with food and place and culture and community. And I think we know it so well because I think for so many of us, when we close our eyes and imagine a special place, the most comfortable place, the most safe places, they involve oftentimes the food of our mothers, of our grandmothers, of our loved ones. They have that scent of those spices that were passed down, that aroma spreading through our homes, right? Running to the table, those favorite meals. I mean, I think it's so essentially part of our DNA. And I think we have to fight for the reclamation of that, because we are giving up our power without even knowing, right? We don't have that power. And I think that famous George Carlin, I think that famous, community talks about, you go to the store to buy donuts and there's 15 flavors of donuts and you think you have choice, but those are, it's all based on the same, ingredients with the exact same corporation. And it's an illusion of choice that dictates our world around us, right? And so I think that's kind of a bit my attempt to kind of address that initial question, right? Like that you laid forth. But I think also what does a growing culture do is we work to build new narratives. And the reason we do that is because we believe that power always rests in people, and that it's the masses and people that change the institutions, that change the laws, the legal guidelines, that change the world around us. And that ultimately true change will always come from grassroots mobilization and a conscious shift of the masses. And how do we get that is by confronting the narratives that paralyze us, right? Like Megan, you said how much food smallholder farmers or the majority world produces, right? That's a debated kind of thing, but it's the majority of the world's food. But the reality is industrial agriculture's rallying cry is what? We feed the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so like buying that PR campaign, we believe that industrial agriculture is necessary in our lives. We believe that it is something we couldn't live without. And I think if you surveyed the masses around the world, people from Zimbabwe to Canada, to Brazil, to China, they would say that industrial agriculture poisons our rivers and our soils, that it produces less nutritious food, that, you know, they understand those dynamics, but they will also all overwhelmingly feel that it's necessary to feed the world. And so it becomes this necessary evil in our lives. It becomes defended. Mm. And as long as we feel that it feeds the world, that we're dependent on it, we will do whatever we can to uphold it. And how do we uphold it? The vast majority of funding goes to academia that uplifts it, to development projects that push it, to narratives that promote it, right? Like and sustainable, organic, agricultural it's a drop in the bucket, right? And it's seen as backwards, as traditional, as outdated, as romanticized version of agriculture, as if we all adopted these kind of models, then the world would grow hungry and there'd be chaos and entropy in the streets, and people would be revolting. And so that's where we sit with as an organization. We work to do communications and narrative change with peasant, indigenous groups, land defenders, farmers all around the world that are fighting for the defense of territory, seed, of culture, land, fighting for food sovereignty, dignity, to exist in a way that they have agency in the way that our food is grown and the food that is on their plates.
I remember, I think sometime in the last year, you worked on a piece about what you just touched on, of how much energy it takes to uphold the industrial agriculture system. And I'm wondering if you want to say more about that, because I found that just really eye-opening and compelling, and so important, speaking of narrative and counter-narrative, of just looking at if you could unpack that more, because I think given how deeply embedded the story is that industrial agriculture is the most efficient and effective and necessary to feed us. Could you say more about what it actually takes to uphold that system and how truly weak it is actually?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to remember exactly what you're referencing. And I think it comes from something that we're all feeling right now, is that we're seeing systems around us collapse, right? And we're feeling this just heavy load of fear, of anxiety, of sorrow, as the world around us is really in many ways crumbling, and I think this comes from
this piece came from a perspective that empire, as it seems this kind of impenetrable force, the logic and scale of industrial agriculture, the logic and scale of our capitalist economic system, the logic and scale of the systems of hegemony around us, they feel like so massive. And this work that we do in opposition to that empire feels so small, right? In scale. And I think what we fail to realize is that so many of the things that we are confronting in this world around us, Megan, are departures from nature and the natural world. The competition and greed are not natural behaviors in ecosystems. Collaboration and harmony are, right? Monocultures, both the field and the mind, are not natural. We bathe in diversity all around us all the time. The natural world does not create monocultures. It creates mutual networks of symbiosis, right? And so whether it's our industrial agricultural field or the narratives and logic of our extractive world around us that upholds it, we feel that these are massive, impenetrable, entities. But in reality, their logic is so brittle because they're built on narratives of fear. And they're built in ways that break every natural law around us. And to live in a way that breaks the natural logic of the world, you are dependent then on massive forms of energy, of subsidization. Would industrial agriculture work if we didn't give it the massive amount of subsidies, the massive amount of development money, to spread it, logic, the massive amount of PR and change and like controlling the narrative of the people? Would it be there? Right? And that's the reality. And so just as any patch of concrete will inevitably crack and grass will break through, every dam will be broken by the once in a million year rainfall. This ties into that Indigenous saying that we don't fight for nature, we are nature that fights. And that is where lies our power. Our power is that we, unlike them, surrender to the tides, not tyranny, right? And because of that, we will eventually prevail. And so I don't think we should be scared of these systems. I think they are precisely scared of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, it feels just so deeply true and obvious when you say that, and it's such a striking example of what you're pointing to and what a growing culture focuses on, of the importance of narrative, of how things that, what you just said all again feels so true, and it is exactly opposite from what most people, what we're all conditioned to think when we don't examine it for ourselves. So like what seems true based on cultural conditioning is actually like 180 from the truth. And so I can really sense in that particular example, just the power of narrative, of like that when we reorient in our own minds, that is the foundation of shifting things. And I know that's what a growing culture focuses on so beautifully. I know there are probably countless narratives that you all tackle and focus on. I'm curious if there's like any other one that comes to mind that you want to share and invite people into, thinking really differently than how we're conditioned to think about it.
But I think
probably the most fundamental starting point might be that this kind of like fascination that our culture has with yield and how we reflect the value of something based on its productive capacity. And we don't understand even when it comes down to its productive capacity, we're not really understanding production from a holistic perspective, right? A acre in Iowa State that's growing corn or soy under heavily industrial and mechanized agriculture can produce 3-4 times the amount of calories that a similar acre under peasant farming systems in India could produce, right? It could produce that. And we would say that that system is more efficient because it's producing a larger amount of calories. But we're not asking where are those calories going, right? We're not asking how many calories it took to create those calories either, right? And when we understand agriculture from a perspective of calories produced, that means nothing of efficiency, because calories produced is very different than calories delivered. And the goal is distribution of food. And that farmer's acre in India that is producing 1/3 the amount of calories actually feeds more people per acre than Iowa does. So where Iowa's caloric efficiency rate, when you calculate that, is it delivers 34% of the calories it grows. But in India, the average is 94%. So when you look at like just the outcome yield, you're missing the whole picture. And in India, they're actually feeding more people than in Iowa. So I think that's something that we have to step back and think about, because every article you read, every narrative you see is how do we increase production, right? We already produce enough food for 1.5 times the world's population, yet over 1 billion people go to bed hungry. Hunger has nothing to do with food produced. Hunger has to do with access. And hunger is solved not by increasing production. It's solved by the political will of people to create equitable and just systems of distribution.
So how does that relate to that output in Iowa? Like, where is that going?
You know this.
A lot of people don't know, though. I mean, to the point of disrupting this narrative, like the yield narrative is very strong, and the fixation, I mean, yeah, it's the whole foundation of the GMO industry is like, we need genetic engineering to feed the world. We need to produce more.
Yeah, of course.
And like your point about the inputs of like, oh, don't worry about all of the Roundup getting sprayed on them and all of the cultural implications of patents and control of food and all of that. So there's that like on the front end. But then, yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that like we're subsidizing corn and then it's going to fuel. Yeah.
No, but I mean, it's going to ethanol, which has just increased, I think, in this new beautiful big bill or whatever it's called, and it's going to animal feeds, which is a very inefficient way to feed humanity. And it's also wasted. It's rotting their distribution channels, and, wasted from our plates. And so there's a huge, in the industrial agricultural model, there's huge holes that people don't want to talk about,
I know also with corn, which is, of course, heavily subsidized, that of the small percentage that is directed into the quote unquote food supply, the vast majority of that is getting turned into high fructose corn syrup for soda.
That's true.
So
exactly.
There's also this whole dimension of like, even when yield translates into quote unquote food for people, the whole question about the nutrient density and the quality of the food in industrial systems compared to other more traditional agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what is even food? Like, what is it? Is that actually food in many ways? Like, do we need that?
And I think a lot of people, I mean, I think it's obvious when you are living closer to nature and directly involved in producing your food, just how important it is to get beyond just calories and thinking about nutrient density. But in the global north, where we have our nutrition facts panels, you know, it really, that's another narrative, actually. It like really makes us think that we know what are the nutrients in food that we need. And we do, of course, know something about that, but a lot of people are shocked that like somewhere between 90 to 99% of the compounds in food, actually scientists call nutritional dark matter. Like we don't actually yet know what these compounds are and how they benefit living systems. But yet, we think that the short list of things on the nutrition facts panels is everything that we need out of food. And it supports this really like reductionist mindset of like, if you get a layer beyond just calories, it's like, okay, and the protein and the fat and the vitamin A or whatever. But really like, we don't know very much yet.
I like that nutritional dark matter. I mean, and this is part of a bigger question that I know that we will be moving into. But when we think of a plant, we think of potato or maize or something like this. In reality, it's not just that other plants have different nutritional densities and diversities and qualities, but it's also other varieties of that plant. And I think that what's really important here is to understand is that the industrial agricultural system also breeds that nutrition out of these plants that used to hold that sacred nutritional density and, sustenance in a multitude of different ways, right? And as it's not just that we are changing our agricultural system to grow a less amount of crops, it's less varieties of those crops, oftentimes a singular variety of each of those crops. And within that, we lose not only that memory and that history, but also that nutritional density of all those different varieties, the medicinal qualities of all those different varieties, the climate adaptive, practices, right? That allow some of those varieties can grow in droughts or in floodings or in salt water or whatnot, but also some of those varieties, they taste different. They think like, they hold different cultural significance, right? And so we're losing all of that within it, right? And I think that's something that's really important to bring to attention.
Yeah, and because it's not only that it's getting bred out in the industrial ag system, but it's actually the diversity of our seed and source material for the world's food supply is under threat by legal repression. And so this is something that we, Non-GMO Project and A Growing Culture, are starting this campaign work on, with engaging the natural products industry in North America with this connection to seed and source. And the foundation for that is like just starting by bringing awareness to what is happening with seed laws around the world and the criminalizing of seed and diversity. And I would love if you could help. I know it's such a deep, vast topic, but just provide our listeners with a good overview of what's happening, because again, I just think most people have no idea. They might know what you just shared of like, yeah, we're losing crop diversity within the industrial agriculture system, but they don't realize that there's actually a war being waged on the cultural diversity of our food.
Well, I'm glad we spoke about control, right? Because I think that's where
it kind of comes together. And that's like in an effort to control our food system, corporations want to control the seed. And today there's a monopoly on seed. 4 companies control 70% plus of our seed reserves. They have bought out all of the smaller seed companies and buried their genetics. They have passed legalized legal frameworks and push legal frameworks that have effectively led to the ecocide of our varieties. And this is a serious issue that blows my mind that it's not the dominant narrative that we are speaking about all the time. And so I think what Megan is pushing me to speak about is the legal framework around a international treaty that was designed to protect breeders' rights called UPOV. And this legal treaty was developed by the same the same countries that have led the colonial history of the world, right? And this is precisely a legal framework to colonize plant life and to control it all around the world. And so basically, this legal framework of UPOV, which is mandated and pushed on the majority world since 1991, basically provides the legal framework for the criminalization of Indigenous peasant seed systems. And so those Indigenous and peasant seed systems are now under attack, as Megan said. And these are seed systems that have passed down through the reproductive genius of women over generations, seeds that were woven into the hair of enslaved Black women who were brought to the United States, seeds that were saved and part of cultural and marriage ceremonies, a whole part of that have fed us through the most hardest times of our life, that families have shaped alongside their natural environments, are now being banned and criminalized all around the world. And this is the most pressing threat to agricultural sovereignty through the innovation of the natural and organic food industry, to the resilience and agency of peasant and smallholder farmers, to the nutritional and medicinal worlds that we live in. We need to defend this territory and push back. And that's what, our collaboration on. And I think this is something that is super important to every one of us on this planet today, because this is the future of humanity, which is tied in coexistence with the future of these seeds.
Yeah, thank you. And so definitely more to come on all of this as we start working with the natural products industry, because part of that also is going to be educating the eating public at large about this and just getting more information out. I also know that you all have some incredible videos, and we could link one of those in the show notes so people who want to learn more and, hear additional perspectives on what's happening can do that. I'm curious, thinking back to some of our conversations about political agency, which is a charged topic in these times.
Yeah.
And I think part of reclaiming our sovereignty is to recognize that our political agency extends far beyond just who we vote for in organized elections.
Yeah.
Not to diminish the importance of that, but I think it's an example of another narrative that keeps us really weak, is when we think that's our only thing that we can do. Or even protesting, which also is powerful, but there's this whole dimension of how we live our lives and the choices we make every day it is a political act, whether or not we're conscious of it. And I'm curious, just as we wrap up this conversation, in light of everything you've said of the power, the power to create the world through culture and through our narratives, anything that you want to leave people with of, how we think about, because many people are not growing food, and it's so compelling hearing you talk about the opportunity to be in right relationship and connection when we're growing food. And so I'm just curious for someone who's like maybe in an apartment in a city listening to this, what could you leave them with for inspiration of like how they could start shifting their narrative and how even that, like even how shifting our mindset can be a powerful political act? Any thoughts that come to mind around that?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that we should talk about is that politics is a function of everything that we do in the world around us, that transform the world around us, right? Like, and that is it. It's what books we decide to read. It's what books the teacher assigns in their syllabus are political decisions, right? It's how much you tip the waiter, how you treat your staff, how you engage with your community, how you shape a discussion at dinner, right? Like how you demonstrate, and exist within your own community are all deeply political actions that many times have more power than the actions we think and call political, to be quite honest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something we have to realize. Now, I'm not going to sit here and talk about like the desire for people to be more conscious consumers, because I struggle with that, like that modality of thought, right? Because I think one of the most anti-democratic things I've ever heard is the rallying cry of so much of the industry, which is vote with your dollar, right? And I think
which we have said a lot. So I just want to out myself of like, I've definitely bought into that. So I'm curious what you have to say about it. I mean, I think you and I have talked about this before, but I just want to be transparent of like, I've definitely gotten on board with that. So like, tell us more about why that's anti-democratic.
Well, I mean, I think when you're seeing oligarchs like buy our elections and put unbelievable money backing certain candidates, and folks, you're seeing that equating democracy with like purchasing power is extremely anti-democratic, right? Like, and so when you say vote with your dollar, does that mean people with more money have more votes, right? Like, what are we looking at, right? And I think that's the challenging aspect of that narrative, right? We exist, a lot of people exist in places that are not food deserts, but food apartheid, where they don't have that choice and power. And fighting for that choice and power, I think, is really important for all of us. I think understanding food systems is understanding that we live in a system where they are all our children, right? Like everyone is our children. And we should fight that every child has that right, not just our own, right? That the better one person does, the better we do. We need to collectivize our care and globalize our solidarity, right? And so these, I don't have prescriptive actions, but I invite people to think about the ways that they could show up in solidarity with others, right? Where they can exercise that political consciousness and thinking in the small acts of the day, right? Like in even the most basic places, right? Like how you talk to your child about food, how you talk to another person's child about food, how you engage around the dinner table, and how we treat people is the political decisions that I want to invite people to reclaim and to feel empowered by, right? And so I think that's a really important dynamic, right? And And I think so often this kind of narrative around conscious consumers now, if people can afford to, they can actually, absolutely, right? But I think also there's amazing opportunities to build solidarity and mutual aid networks in our own communities to get food out there. And so not thinking that it's just sustainable is the way to go, but to look from a lens of power when we talk about our food systems and we talk about access and equity, right? And I think this becomes a really challenging dynamic because one of the things we wrestle with is this perspective around food cost, right? Like, and food is something which, like, the cost of food is rising, or eggs is becoming a big narrative, right, in the United States. And we're wrestling with how do we navigate this, right? And I think people want to be really sensitive to the dynamic around people to have food access, right? And that people can't afford food. But I also think it's really important for us to reflect on this from a bigger holistic understanding. Are we fighting for food to be cheaper, or are we fighting for wages to be higher, right? And so often, 7 out of 10 of the most underpaid jobs in the United States are in the food sector. And when we drive down the cost of food, it's not Cargill and DuPont and Monsanto and Walmart that are getting squeezed. It's the compensation of all of the people that it took to produce that food. And they don't have buying power. And I think that opens up a political dynamic around how we look at the price of food, right? Farmers around the world are starving because they can't afford to buy food. It's not that food doesn't exist. They don't have the purchasing power because they're not being compensated in a fair way. And so how do we look at the cheapification of food? Because it's the cheapification of food that is turning people into from subjects who are able to transform their world around them to objects of food poverty, right? Like, and this is the reality that we have to navigate. And so I think when we look at these questions, I want to just invite people to listen to folks that they're not listening to exit their perspectives and their worldviews and their lenses, and to engage in a deeper conversation that reflects on power and consolidation and control. Because so often the solutions that I see to feeding the world, to hunger, further consolidate control in the hands of the few. And I think that is the most dangerous thing. We talk about oligarchy. We are in a time of unparalleled food oligarchy. And if you believe in democracy, if you believe in those sacred values that we hold dear, then food systems should be designed by the ones who grow our food, not by the corporations that control it. And when we use that frame and that lens, how do we look at things like food access? How do we look at things like nutritional density? How do we look at things like the kitchens that not only that we eat in, but the school kitchens and hospital kitchens and the world around us, the consolidation of land, right? These are all questions that we get to explore with a greater nuance and a greater invitation to remember and find our own humanity.
Thank you so much, Loren. I leave every conversation with you just deeply moved in my mind, considering new things, and also, in spite of all the sobering things that I've learned from you, also, I always feel inspired when we finish talking. So thank you for being here and sharing that, and for the work that you do. And I'm so glad to be on this journey with you.
Thank you, Megan. The feeling is incredibly mutual. So grateful to
to be in relation with you. It's been a wonderful journey, and I'm so excited to what we get to build together. Thank you.
Yay! Thanks, Loren. Thank you for joining us on FutureKind. Remember, every choice we make ripples through the web of life. Until next time, stay curious, stay conscious, and keep making choices that nourish FutureKind. FutureKind is brought to you by the Non-GMO Project and the Food Integrity Collective. New episodes emerge with each new moon. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform and share your FutureKind moments with us on social media using #FutureKind. Music by Yaima, Masaru Higasa, and Pepper Proud. Rise Ceremonia 6.